really excited that you're all able to join us today. This training we've been working on for about a year. It's been ACEs certified. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, the Surgeon General for the state of California, and her ACEs Aware initiative have reviewed and approved the training as a certified supplemental ACEs Aware training. And so we're real excited to be able to share with you today. All right, so there are actually going to be 7 modules for this training. It's entitled ChemTem, the impact of ACEs and toxic stress on Indigenous communities. And so we'll be sharing 2 models today of the modules. Tomorrow will be 2 more, and then we'll finish up with the remainder on Friday. So hope that you're all able to join us Wednesday, Thursday, Friday between 1 and 3:30 p.m. And as I shared in the email, if you are unable to attend, it is important to attend all the modules or to be able to see them. So we will be sending you recordings so that you can also keep track with those as well. So these are our training learning objectives for today. And so at the end of the training, our goal is that participants will be able to define adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, and their prevalence, health disparities in these data, toxic stress physiology, and really the impacts on health, including the underlying biological mechanisms. We also hope that participants will be able to describe how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities, specifically throughout California, must include an understanding of their histories and how these experiences relate to intergenerational transmission of adversity and protective factors from Indigenous perspective. And then also to describe how the content of these modules support screening for ACEs and treatment of toxic stress in Indigenous communities. So these are the 3 primary goals. And just to kind of shorten those is to be able to define what diverse adverse childhood experiences are, and to be able to understand within Indigenous communities, in order to provide the trauma-informed care, it's really important to understand the histories and the experiences of the community in order to understand the current state of Indigenous communities. And so the training modules, the first one will focus on the ACEs Aware mission, and kind of the piece where we define what adverse childhood experiences are. And then the second module, we'll be talking about the ChemTem, A Journey Toward Healing book. And so I'm also the co-editor with my father, Dr. Waltler Sr., of the ChemTem, A Journey Toward Healing textbook, which is a supplemental tool for this training. And so if you're interested in receiving a free copy of the book, if you could private message me in the chat your name and your mailing address, and then we can mail you a copy of the book. And so we're utilizing the book to help kind of share some of the topics on ACEs today. And then the third module is preparing for trauma-informed care in Indigenous communities. The fourth one is on Indigenous tribes of California. The fifth one is intergenerational transmission of adversity. The module 6 is on activities to interrupt toxic stress response. And then finally, the culminating module is on bridging and also assessment. And so throughout the training, we do have clips of different presenters from the community as well that we'll be sharing, and we're excited about too. And so looking at the learning objective for this particular module is to be able to define adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and their prevalence. Sometimes we use the term ACEs, and knowing that there's actually specific studies and backgrounds that go with it. And so the ACEs Aware mission is to change and save lives by helping providers understand the importance of screening for adverse childhood experiences and training providers to respond with trauma-informed care to mitigate the health impacts of toxic stress. And so as this is a supplemental training, one of the pieces that we encourage is for people to also engage in the core ACEs Aware trainings and kind of promoting the idea of screening clients. And so when we talk about the ACEs Aware initiative, it actually came from this landmark study. And so the landmark study was actually led by Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda. It had more than 17,000 patients that were from the Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. These patients were surveyed on their medical history and then their exposure to 10 different categories of adversity in their childhood. And this study was done between 1995 and 1997. And so when we talk about ACEs, it actually comes from this kind of landmark ACEs study. And so from the study, researchers found that having an ACE was actually common among human beings, but they also learned that as the number of ACEs increased, the risk of poor health outcomes increased as well. And so this is important when we look at our local community, and we'll be talking about here pretty soon, is that the higher the number of ACEs, the more likely the risk of poor health outcomes. And so the Center for Youth Wellness said that in subsequent studies, the life expectancy of a person with 6 or more ACEs was actually shortened by 20 years. And so this is why it's important for us to really understand the historical, the intergenerational aspects that influences the health of people today. And so to share with you another piece of this ACE study is when we talk about ACEs, it actually has 10 different categories that we're talking about when we look at adverse childhood experiences. And so the ACE Aware initiative utilizes these 10 ACE categories that came out of this 1998 landmark ACE study. And so they're divided into abuse. And so if you look at the left side of the PowerPoint here, it has the abuse section. And in here is looking at physical, emotional, or sexual abuse that a child may have experienced. And then there's another category that looks at neglect. And then this neglect could be physical or emotional. ACEs Aware also looks at the household challenges. So you've got abuse, neglect, and then this piece on household challenges. And in the original study, that was actually referred to as household dysfunction, but the CDC retermed that to household challenges. So growing up in a household with parental incarceration or mental illness, substance abuse, misuse or dependence, absence of a parent due to separation or divorce, intimate partner violence, all of these things are considered within this category of household challenges. And so when we talk about ACE scores, what we're actually talking about is a person can look at this diagram and identify what they have experienced in categories of abuse, neglect, or household challenges, and actually can count those up. And then that would be their score. And so the maximum ACE score would be 10. And as I stated earlier, it's actually common for human beings to have at least one ACE in their experience. So one of the pieces that's important to recognize is that the 10 ACEs that are identified in this landmark study aren't the only risk factors for toxic stress. And so when we talk about the landmark study, when we talk about the ACEs Aware initiative, we're looking at these 10 categories, but there's other factors such as racial discrimination, separation from a parent or a caregiver, for reasons like deportation or migration, or even medical traumas that can also be risk factors for toxic stress. And so these aren't the only pieces that influence toxic stress, but they are the categories that we utilize when we're speaking of ACEs and the ACE score. So then we start looking at the prevalence of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, in California, and we start to learn a little bit more about who is experiencing ACEs. And so according to the California Department of Public Health, and you can see in this diagram, 62% of Californians experience at least one ACE. And so the map of California illustrates this prevalence of at least one ACE in counties throughout California. And so if you look at the diagram, you notice that there's a lot of yellow and a lot of orange and a lot of red, and that indicates even higher presence of adverse childhood experiences. So in 2014's data report on adverse childhood experiences in California, and that was done by the Center for Youth Wellness, it was found that even in the counties with the lowest ACE prevalence, that 1 out of every 2 residents had experienced at least one ACE. And so then if you look at the pie charts that are right next to the state of California there, you can see that these are the percentages based on ethnicity. And oftentimes Indigenous peoples aren't included in these charts. So we'll be talking about Indigenous peoples here soon. So those that experience 0 ACEs are in yellow. 1 ACE you could see is in blue, and then 2 to 3 ACEs is green, 4 or more ACEs is purple. So you can kind of see when you look at the diagram among white, I put in quotes, people, the prevalence of 4 or more ACEs is 16.4%. And then among Hispanic Latino is 3% with 4 or more ACEs. And once again, the reason why we look at why would the number of more ACEs be significant is that we know that research shows that the higher the number of ACEs, the greater risk that a person has with health conditions later on in life. And so these alarming social indicators is one of the reasons why we have these sorts of trainings to have discussions and to promote this screening. And so if we take it a little closer kind of to the region that we're looking at here today, and we think of the prevalence of ACEs in Northwestern California, we can see that compared to the last diagram, we're getting more into the red and the deep red colors. And so the prevalence of ACEs in Northwestern California counties is even greater. And Humboldt and Mendocino counties, for example, rate among the highest percent of residents in the whole state of California that has at least one ACE across California counties. So we're at 75% prevalence in Humboldt and Mendocino counties. And so just to kind of give you an idea, and if I were to go back a slide again, you're looking at a lot of this yellow in Southern California, some orange, but as we move to the Northwest region in the counties that we're in, there's higher numbers of people who actually experience at least one ACE score, and it's at 75% prevalence. So when we look at prevalence then among Indigenous peoples, is that with Indigenous peoples, there's less research that's looking specifically at Indigenous communities. But it is important because it wasn't shown in the diagram here, looking at ACEs in Indigenous communities. It's important to kind of look at and create our own sort of assessment on that. And as we talk through the presentation, I just want to make sure that when I am referring to First Peoples of California, I'll utilize Indigenous throughout the presentation. But if the research that I'm citing, if they utilize a term like Native American, American Indian, or Native, then I'll use the term that they're using. And so nationally, when we look at prevalence among Indigenous peoples, you have Richard, Schatz, and Wright that talk about Native Americans have the highest rate of adverse childhood experiences, and this is including the physical and sexual abuse and violence of any other racial and ethnic group. And in South Dakota, for example, Warren, in his article 2017, he found that Native Americans reported higher rates of prevalence in all 10 categories than any other race ethnic group. And 19% of Native American youth reported 6 or more ACEs. And this is compared to non-Native youth at 4%. And so when we're looking at Indigenous youth having experienced 6 or more ACEs, 19% of our youth have experienced 6 or more ACEs. That's significant when we're looking at then how that impacts their well-being and their health. And so locally in Hoopa, in a recent study in Hoopa, California, 31.4% of Indigenous peoples had an ACE score of 4 or more. And this is compared to the diagrams that we looked at back here. You compare that with 16.4%, 16.5%, 17.3%, 11% of California's non-Indigenous populations. So even looking at the highest, which is the Latino population at 17.3% that have 4 or more ACEs, Indigenous peoples are almost double that. And so this is the reason why we're having this discussion today, is to not only identify why this is, but also to start talking about and having discussions about screening and how to heal as a community. And so additional adversities we talked about that are risk factors for toxic stress. So in addition to the 10 ACEs, so social determinants of health, they include the 10 ACEs from the landmark study, but they're not limited to that. And so it's important to understand that social determinants of health and conditions in the environment in which people live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. So the social determinants of health are education, employment, health systems and services, housing, income and wealth, the physical environment, public safety, the social environment, and transportation. And while validated odds ratios are available in large population-based studies using the 10 criteria we talked about, the strengths of association between other experiences or social determinants of health and other outcomes have not been similarly standardized. So what this means is that we can look at those 10 categories of ACEs, but also to understand that there's other factors that influence toxic stress and that can be risk factors for toxic stress. And for Indigenous peoples, that can include things like for example, in California, you have Native Americans have the second highest report of child maltreatment in California. So these are types of factors that can be social determinants of health that can further kind of perpetuate or this toxic stress and can then have long-term effects on health. And so these discussion and these pieces are important. And looking at Humboldt County, for example, we know that Native Americans make up less than 7% of Humboldt County's population, yet 30% of the foster care handled by the County Department of Health and Human Services. We know that Native Americans have the highest rate per 1,000 of substantiated cases of child abuse and neglect. We also know that between 2016 and 2018, that Native Americans in Humboldt County have the highest first entry into foster care, and that 25.8% of Indigenous students in Humboldt County considered suicide in 2019. And so just kind of just taking a moment to really look at this slide here and thinking about not only are Indigenous peoples experiencing at higher rates, and we looked at Hoopa, for example, 30+% of 4 or more ACEs compared to the general population, 14 to 17%. So almost double of adverse childhood experiences, but then we're also looking at additional factors, social determinants of health that also impact toxic stress in Indigenous communities. And also, while I'm sharing all of these numbers, just to remind us that we're talking about Indigenous peoples, we're talking about our community, we're talking about our children, our aunts, uncles, family members, and that our people are more than just numbers. And so really looking at the types of things that are impacting Indigenous communities. In addition to this, one of the kind of social determinants that heavily impact Indigenous peoples is suicide among Indigenous peoples. And so we know that suicide is the second leading cause of death among Indigenous adolescents. We also know that childhood adversity is associated with Indigenous suicidal behavior and ideations, and that research has linked perceived discrimination and acculturation stress with Indigenous suicide ideations. And so just to kind of process this slide again, and to kind of really think about what it means, is that we know that Indigenous peoples, the leading cause or second leading cause of death among Indigenous adolescents is suicide. We also know that childhood adversity is associated with suicidal behavior and ideations. And then we know that research links discrimination and acculturative stress with Indigenous suicide and ideation. So when we piece all of this together, it helps us to kind of see the kind of struggles, the impacts of this toxic stress. And so then we look at the health inequities for Indigenous peoples. And this is important because we're talking about the higher the ACE score, the higher the risk for health inequity. It doesn't mean, and I want to reiterate, doesn't mean that a person that has a high ACE score is going to experience health risks or is going to have these types of health disparities. But what it does mean is that it's important to screen a person that has a high ACE score. It's important to screen them. And so that way we're aware of these things. And so we know that for Indigenous peoples that diabetes is 177% higher than any other ethnic group. And the highest rate of type 2 diabetes of any specific population in the United States. We also know that tuberculosis incidences are 500% higher than the general US population, that Native teens experience the highest rate of suicide of any population, as we shared before, 10 times the national norm, and that violence accounts for 75% of deaths for Native youth ages 12 to 20. So we start thinking about why do these things matter? We're talking about all of these statistics and all of the health disparities and health inequities. Why does this matter? And what does this mean for Indigenous communities? And what it shows is that ACEs are common, but ACEs are overrepresented in Indigenous communities, and that ACEs accumulate over time. So we can't unexperience something. And so when we look at this diagram here, these are all of the different parts of a person's health that are impacted by these adverse childhood experiences. And ACEs is strongly associated with some of the more common and serious health conditions. And so as we were speaking before, is that those that have 4 or more ACEs, for example, are 37.5 times more likely to attempt suicide, 11.2 times more likely to have Alzheimer's or dementia, 3 times more likely to have chronic lower respiratory disease. So these things have a correlation. So when we talk about why does this matter, it's that these experiences are have potential to impact a person's health. And so then when we look at this toxic stress response, and I'll just go ahead and read the slide here of what the definition of toxic stress response is that we know toxic stress can be heightened by adverse childhood experiences. And we talked about the 10 categories that can heighten toxic stress. And we also talked about some of the social determinants of health that can impact toxic stress. Things like racial discrimination, separation from parents, different traumas, loss of family members, suicide, health disparities, these sorts of things that can also influence toxic stress. And so toxic stress response is a consensus of scientific evidence demonstrates that high doses of cumulative adversity experienced during critical and sensitive periods of early life development without the buffering protections of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments can lead to long-term disruptions of brain development, immune and hormonal systems, and genetic regulatory mechanisms, a condition now known as toxic stress response. And so in reading this slide, I just want to reiterate again, because we don't want to keep this to where it feels like it's kind of a hopeless cause. I just want to draw your attention to the piece that says, without the buffering protections of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. And so we will talk about later in this training some of those protective factors, because that's a real important piece in maintaining health and in the process of healing. And so there is hope in this discussion, but first we're trying to demonstrate the need for this. And so the toxic stress response, once again, is a consensus of scientific evidence demonstrates that high doses of cumulative adversity experienced during critical and sensitive periods of early life development without the buffering protections of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments can lead to long-term disruptions of brain development, immune and hormonal systems, and genetic regulatory mechanisms, and a condition that's now known as toxic stress. And so when we talk about stress, stress itself is not necessarily a bad thing. We can actually have positive stress, tolerable stress, and then there's the toxic stress. And so when you think of positive stress response, sometimes the stress helps us to grow. It helps us to develop. It helps us to get things done. So for example, if you have a big test or you have a game, you're doing a presentation, this type of stress helps us to accomplish and helps us to achieve things. And so there are these types of positive stress response that can happen. And this positive stress, though, is usually short-lived. It's usually something that happens for a short period of time. And then there's the tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is something that is a little bit harder on the body, but it is something that maybe a person experiences a natural disaster. Maybe a person loses a loved one, has a frightening injury, and experiences this level of stress, but the stress is tolerable. And once again, it has a time frame to it. It has this kind of point where it eases up at some point. Toxic stress is different, though, because toxic stress is a prolonged activation of the stress response system. And so it can disrupt the developments of the brain's architecture and other organ systems. And so toxic stress is when a person is continuously affected by the stress consistently. And it's an extended period of time, and sometimes even an unknown period of time. So when we talk about toxic stress and we talk about how stress affects our body, it's important to understand that there are these different types of stress, and that some of the stress can actually be good for us. And when we're talking about toxic stress, we're talking about the type of stress that's the result of a disruption of the development of the brain, of the organs. It increases lifelong risk for physical and mental health disorders, stress that is continuing and ongoing. So when we speak of toxic stress, this is what we're speaking of. And when a child or a person experiences this toxic stress in early life, it can affect the body. And so exposure to ACEs in particular, in the absence of protective factors, and once again, I'm mentioning protective factors, which we'll be talking about at the end of this week, because this isn't a destined thing that a person that experiences adverse childhood experiences is going to end up here. There's also protective factors that can help in this process. So in the absence of protective factors, exposure to these ACEs can alter the biological stress response, and it can disrupt the development of the neuroendocrine, immune, metabolic, and genetic regulatory mechanisms. And that leads to a toxic stress response, which then can increase health problems physically, mentally, and behaviorally. And so in this diagram, you can see the toxic stress and how it can affect the different parts of the body. And so it's important to recognize that the purpose of ACE screening is not specifically to identify ACEs per se, but to identify patients at risk for developing toxic stress or experiencing ACE-associated health conditions. And so another piece that's really important to recognize is that while there's research underway to identify clinical diagnostic criteria and biomarkers for toxic stress response, that this is still research that's underway. It's research that's still happening. But we do know that cumulative adversity is the greatest risk factor for development of the toxic stress response. And so that's the reason why we are encouraging screening for adverse childhood experiences. And so then when we look at ACE associated health conditions, so we talk about how the ACEs and how other social determinants of health can affect toxic stress, and it can then the toxic stress affects our body. Then we further look at the ACEs and how it impacts the conditions of our health. And so we know that some of the health that can be affected is cardiovascular, pulmonary, immune, metabolic, mental health, and then substance use conditions that are also part of that. So while the relationship between ACEs and mental health outcomes is most commonly recognized, a recent meta-analysis demonstrates the single greatest driver of ACE-associated healthcare costs is cardiovascular disease. So this is just another one to kind of put out there that in research that's being found, people that have this higher scores with adverse childhood experiences, how it's impacting their health. So another example here, and this is looking at general populations across the United States, is that those that have 4 or more ACEs, once again, have 2.1% higher chance or times higher chance of heart disease, 2.3 times higher chance of cancer, 2.6 higher chance of unintentional injuries, 3.1% of chronic lower respiratory disease, 2 times the stroke, 11.2%, I keep saying percent, I mean times, 11 times the chance of Alzheimer's. And then even looking at suicide, once again, we mentioned this before, 37.5 times the chances. So that's why this is so important, is looking at the increase in number and then what is being seen in the research of how people are impacted. This is another diagram that shows pediatrics and looking at children who have experienced 4 or more ACEs and the ratio. So 2.8 times more risk of chance or occurrence of asthma, 2 times more chance of dermatitis. And so you can see on this list, and I'll leave it up for a second, so you can see how children are impacted in early stages from adverse childhood experiences. And just a reminder again, if you would like a copy of the CAMTEM Journey Toward Healing book to supplement this training, to please put your name and address into the chat. And we'll get those to you. Also, we for the question period, because it is a certified training and everything that's being shared is certified, I won't be able to answer questions directly during this period, but you can always email me, or we can talk at a different time to address your questions. To the next slide. This is another slide looking at ACE-associated health conditions among adults. So just giving you a chance to kind of look at this. Some of the higher numbers here in looking at people who have 4 or more ACEs, some of the higher numbers, 11% or 11 times higher cannabis use. Another one here, 10.2 times for injected drug, crack cocaine, heroin use. And so when we talk about substance abuse in our communities, it's also important, once again, to be aware of the adverse childhood experiences that may correlate with some of the experiences that our clients are having. And so the clinical response kind of overview is that applying principles of trauma-informed care, such as establishing trust, safety, and collaborative decision-making is important. And then also supplementing usual care for ACE-associated health conditions by providing patient education on toxic stress. So these are some of the kind of recommendations in working with clients, having supportive relationships, high quality, sufficient sleep, balanced nutrition, regular physical activity, mindfulness and meditation, experiencing nature, mental health care, etc. And so this brings us into another discussion when we're talking about the word resilience. And so I know in Indigenous communities, we often use or often hear the word resilience, and we have our own kind of internal meaning of what that word means. In ACEs Aware and the ACEs Aware initiative, resilience means the ability to withstand or recover from stressors. And it results from a combination of intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors, like safe, stable, and nurturing relationships with family members and others, as well as predisposing biological susceptibility. And so whenever you hear the term resilience used around ACEs or ACEs Aware, this is the definition that they are utilizing. But I also want to share with you another definition, which is from an Indigenous perspective, and it's one of many definitions among Indigenous communities. But this is a diagram that we came up with on resilience and resilience tools. And I worked with 4 youth on an article that's coming out actually in a book chapter on New Year's Eve with Charlene Wan, Everett Bronk-Colgrove, Tesha Jinsa, and Gable Ammon. And so we utilized kind of the framework from the Kiwanyatnyan Ma'olhunu study on giftedness. But these 4 youth identified what resilience meant to them and what resilience tools meant to them. And these resilience tools, when we talk about the things that help to protect. So for example, before when it said without the buffering of relationships and supportive environments, when we've heard the word protective factors before, this is from a youth perspective, some of the protective factors or resilience tools to help children despite increased adverse childhood experiences, despite social determinants of health, what can also be used as a protective factor. And so we'll be talking about this a little bit more later in the week, but I wanted to show this to you from a local Indigenous youth perspective. And so in looking at the diagram, you can see the resilience tools breaks into kind of this supportive relationships, relationships with the human elements, such as community, extended family, and that includes spiritual families or dance families, having connections with elders, learning self-care. And sometimes this is learned through ceremonies, sometimes through transition ceremonies into womanhood or manhood, learning how to care for themselves. The youth identified support programs. And so there are local support programs such as Two Feathers Native American Family Services, Pottawat Health Village, that the youth identified as being important as a resilience tool. Another aspect to this is looking at the natural elements, so relationships with the natural environment. And the youth describe relationships with the river, relationships with their homelands, with their villages, where they come from, and relationships with their prayer sites or their ceremonial sites, that these connections to them are what have helped them to maintain in their definition of resilience, as protective factors to keep them healthy. Another example in this is the spiritual elements, relationships with the spiritual realm, including their songs, ancestors, regalia, prayer, ceremony, the oswayach or the canoe, and their original instructions. And what that means is they're the teachings, the ancient knowledge of our people. And so when we're thinking about and we're talking about health disparities, and we're talking about the statistics, and we're talking about some of these things that sometimes can feel a little bit disheartening, there's also another piece to this, which is looking at the resilience tools, the protective factors from an Indigenous perspective, to healing and to balancing and having healthy communities. And so this is one of those perspectives. And so the ACEs Aware provider training, if you want to be a part of any of the other ACEs Aware initiative trainings, the core trainings, or even looking to at different supplemental trainings, this is the link where you can access those.